a really foundational part of my business development as a business leader came from working at MVB Financial Corp. And obviously, banks and financial institutions have some pretty significant regulations when it comes to what happens when disaster strikes, right? There's this whole element of the way that the U.S. federal government regulates banks, other financial institutions related to business continuity management.
Hey, it's the Profit Answer Man, Rocky Lalvani. If you're new to the podcast, check out my interview with Mike Michalowicz. It's episode number 2. If you want to hear about each chapter in the Profit First book, go back and listen to episodes 3 through 13. Episode 1 is the why and how. On the Profit Answer Man, we learn money mastery without all the complicated accounting mumbo-jumbo using a simple system. Your accountant is busy documenting your transactions and creating a rearview mirror of what happened. My guess is you don't even look at the reports they sent you. If you're like most business owners, you struggle with this. And it's not your fault. We aren't taught money in school, and accountants aren't taught how to be profitable. The Profit First system created by Mike Michalowicz works, and he certified me to help you implement the system in your business. Remember, the new equation is sales minus profit equals expenses. Let's face it, without cash flow, you can't pay your employees, buy needed materials, or pay your mortgage and support your family. I help you to do that and more, so you can focus on the parts of the business you love and receive the rewards for your labor and investment into your business. The stronger you are as a business owner, the more jobs you create, the better we are as a country. Small business owners are the backbone of America, and for that, you deserve to be well rewarded. Just remember, more revenue does not equal more profit. That's why we focus on the bottom line.
Every month on the second Thursday, we've got a live Q&A to answer all your Profit First questions. There's a link in the show notes to sign up. I made it easier because the old system was too difficult. So check it out. Hope to chat with you and help you be more profitable. Today's convo is all about laying the groundwork for business success, putting in the sound systems and processes in place up front. I know most of you don't build a foundation under your business. You just get started and then you go, we'll deal with it someday. Well, someday never comes. Today, we've got an expert, Patrick Esposito. He's an experienced entrepreneur. He just wrote the book called The Structure of Success. He'll share how to build a good framework to guide major decisions and the key differences between thriving businesses and those that fail in the future. He'll share with us 8 essential areas that leaders need to talk about and what's most important to you. We'll even cover some disaster planning so that we are ready for what happens. You've got to be proactive and design infrastructure to support growth ahead of time so that you can avoid the pitfalls. You know, I always talk about the road less stupid. Well, let's learn from other people's mistakes. We don't have to make them ourselves. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So let's do this ahead of time. We'll share practical, actionable insights today. Let's meet Patrick and learn how. Welcome to the Profit Answer Man, Patrick Esposito. It's great to have you join us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Excited to learn from you. Can you share a little bit about yourself and your business?
So I would characterize myself in some ways as an accidental entrepreneur, an accidental business person, formerly trained as a lawyer, licensed to practice, realized very quickly that, I perhaps was better in business and advising business leaders, not just from a legal perspective, but also from a management and operational perspective. So after practicing for a brief period with a law firm and serving as a counsel to a state governor, I launched a small, at that point, consulting company, but with an eye towards creating a solution-oriented software company called Augusta Systems. Eventually, after a couple of pivots, it became an early Internet of Things middleware company, and we added some venture capital, grew the company, and ultimately transitioned the team and the technologies through an acquisition into a publicly traded market leader, Hexagon, and utilized roughly the same formula a second time on a company, Resilient Technologies, which was focused on non-pneumatic or airless tires, and grew that with a little bit of angel investment to an acquisition by Polaris. So, I guess came of age through those two ventures, and then worked for a brief period as part of the executive team at MVB Financial, a regional financial services firm. It's actually grown now to nationwide. Realized that I really enjoyed that experience, being part of an executive team and helping to advise leaders as much as I helped leading. So out of that, decided to create two businesses. One, ACME General Corp, that focuses on public sector innovation support for DoD, and the other, Initiative Labs, which focuses on support for small and medium-sized business leaders, deploying the framework that I've sort of been using for the last 2 decades that now is in print in the Structure of Success that came out in October from Greenleaf Book Group under their Inc. original imprint.
A whole lot of entrepreneurial history and business history.
Indeed.
Any big lessons you learned from all of that? Or is that really what the book's about, is all of those lessons?
Yeah. So to your point, the book is really about those lessons, right? And, I probably would not have ended up with a book if we all hadn't lived through that early portion of the COVID-19 pandemic, when we had a little bit of time that was unallocated, right? We used to be doing business travel. And before we figured out how to do business Zooms and other web meetings effectively, there was this sort of period of trying to figure out exactly how you were going to manage and what you were going to do in the future. So spent some time during that with really trying to document what were the lessons learned, did some research with a group of 100 other business leaders who achieved various, levels of success and notoriety in their businesses, and realized that, what I saw, right, the need to have a structured framework to support decision-making around, critical and strategic categories really was the difference between success and failure for most small and medium-sized businesses, and dove into really sort of trying to understand what those categories were and what was the right way to make sure that you, as a leader, right, of a business, looked at those and looked at them in an appropriate amount of regularity to make sure that you didn't drive your business off the cliff.
What percentage of businesses do you think have a framework that they use for that type of decision making?
So it's actually a great question. So what I will say is, if you talk to business owners, the majority of owners who have achieved some level of success will tell you that they do, right? Probably roughly 70%. Now, when you ask them what the regularity is that they refresh that, it will vary dramatically, right? Sometimes these folks say, look, I do this as an annual exercise. Others say I do it quarterly. Others say I do it monthly. Others say I do it whenever it matters. If you look at folks who maybe are struggling, or if they are relatively new, you will see a much lower number than that 70% who use this regularized process. And that's why the vast majority of businesses fail, right? The vast majority of businesses fail because they don't have this regular process for really making sure that their business is tuned up and ready for growth. And, as you like to remind folks, ready for profit, right?
And that is so true. We're going to talk about a couple of these, but before we do, why don't you just kind of give us a real quick top line of what the 8 areas are?
Yep. Perfect. So looking at the work that I had done over 2 decades and kind of taking that anecdotal evidence and then doing a survey of, successful business leaders, it became pretty clear that there were 8 categories that sort of trumped all the others, right? And when you think about it, it's not really going to sound that surprising because they're pretty intuitive, but they're things that a lot of folks ignore. So, the first 2 really focus on your team. And, one of the team areas is a governance team. And a lot of folks who are running small and medium-sized businesses think, why do I need a governance team, right? Governance is this publicly traded, corporate-centric scenario where you've got these board members with gilded resumes. I don't have a bunch of board members with gilded resumes, nor do I have the resources to pay them. And that's when I say, look, governance doesn't have to be about a board of directors. It can be, right? And you could have a board of directors, but it doesn't need to be about, having this formal board structure. It could be about having your professional advisors, right? Your legal, accounting, and other folks, or it could be your friends and family, just serving as your security counsel, right? An extension of your business in a way that you can, folks who you can't pay full time, but who have great wisdom to bring to bear, who can help you as a leader to architect the path forward with your team. And of course, management team, the other part of your team, right? I mean, you've got obviously a lot of folks who work with you, you work with, but your management team and really having folks who can bring a diversity of views in is critically important. And then, to me, it's about the strategy, and both the strategy on how you're going to grow, and do you need to make adjustments and pivots, and how are you going to have the infrastructure to support that growth and the adjustments and pivots. And the next piece, really comes down to, in many ways, right, the relationship that you have, one with your owners or your co-operators, right? And do you have an architecture for managing your business disputes and potentially even a breakup without killing the business? And then how do you manage your transactions, right? Your partnerships, your acquisition opportunities, both to be absorbed by others and to absorb other businesses. And then the last part is the one that I find most leaders really don't enjoy talking about, right? It's being prepared for disasters and thinking about succession planning. And a lot of folks look at that and go, gosh, I can't predict what disasters are coming, so I'm not going to worry about it. Well, obviously, a lack of foresight will end up, ultimately doing more harm to a business than anything else. But when we look at succession planning, I find folks who say, I'm not ready to retire. Okay, got it. But what if you get hit by a bus, right? Odds are pretty good that you'd like to see your business continue to operate. And so, when we look at this 8th category of succession planning, I like to tell folks it's about 2 things, right? It's about the planned succession over a longer term or even a short term. And it's also about the emergency succession. And, those are areas that a lot of businesses ignore to their peril, right? So those are the 8 categories.
Most business owners are busy doing business. They ignore it all.
That's right. That's
just
right. That's
the reality of it. And honestly, and we'll dig more into this, but things happen. COVID happens, recessions happen, health happens, family happens. You have to be ready for all these things. And if you make decisions when you have time to think, things are much easier than making decisions when you're drowning, because then you're just trying to survive and you don't always make the right decisions. I know a couple of these really popped up at me because we deal with it a lot. One of them was the growth in infrastructure development. And, more often than not, most business owners, as they're growing, are too busy growing to even pay attention to some of these things. And then they end up in a situation where trying to get out of the situation becomes very difficult because they've boxed themselves into a corner, and now fixing it becomes, or they made a decision that wasn't thought through all the way. And now undoing that decision takes a considerable amount of time and money. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So to your point, you're exactly right. And again, when you're wired to think profit first, right, as we should be, right, as business leaders, to cite your book there, we are generally cautious around any and all expenditures, right? But what I found from working with, nearly 100 leaders of, organizations, not just small businesses, but also, government agencies, nonprofits, publicly traded companies, is that a lack of infrastructure to support the growth and the profit engine ultimately ends up doing a lot of harm to the leadership team, both I think from the number of hats they're wearing, the number of hours they have to spend, and sometimes with the distraction from propelling the revenue and growth, right? A lot of leaders will say, well, look, I handle the finances. I'm going to handle the HR. There is a time when you need to lay that infrastructure for growth, bring on those non-revenue creating, personnel who can help you drive revenue even higher. And the same thing goes for, your operational systems, right? The number of businesses I see and I talk to who don't make some of the key infrastructure investments, whether it's, simple things like, creating a CRM until it's too late and you got too many people pushing too many sales initiatives and not communicating effectively, or, a lack of information and knowledge sharing, right? I tend to be one of those people who, like most, business leaders, is go, go, go. So thinking of where to put information to make sure my entire team has it to operate effectively is something I really had to learn over time, right? The value in creating that knowledge management. Now, I don't generally recommend going, deeply into overbuilt systems, but there's a small amount of sort of knowledge flow that needs to happen. It needs to be well organized. And, these little infrastructure investments can go a long way towards making your business revenue, profit go higher, and also your team to do, frankly, better in their own work and you not to get as burnt out.
And so part of that, we look at every business owner as a math equation, or every business as a math equation, and figuring out the math equation. In order to figure out the math equation, we need good data. And if they don't have systems to capture, record, and measure good data, everything from, it might be number of hits on a website, number of inquiries, people walking in the door, number of, every business is different. Let's figure out your metric. But if they don't have systems to capture that easily, it becomes a problem. So that's part one. Part two is friction. The more friction between you and your client, the more friction in your support systems, the less likely they get used. And you talked about a plumber, I think, the number one thing we see with them is they don't get their billing out because they don't have good systems to bill the client immediately and collect the money while they're there, so they don't even have to worry about accounts payable and everything else. And so you literally need to build these because that's how you get paid. That's just the reality of it. But it's also important to think about future growth and where are we trying to get to, and then say, how do I build towards growth? Because switching software systems these days is not easy. And what has happened as of recent, which, I guess you all have to keep an eye on your emails and your billing. I'm noticing a lot of software companies are instituting price increases of 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70%. And you just have to be careful because if you've got to switch off of something, it isn't so easy.
Yep, that's absolutely right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And to your point, when we look at those investment decisions, right? One of the things I like to say is I'm always very cautious about making, to your point, those investments in the latest software platform, right, that comes out that everybody latches onto, because often it will get great reviews. It'll start popping up on Twitter. People will be watching some kind of demo on TikTok and they say, hey, we need to use this. Okay, maybe we do, maybe we don't. But let's think about this, because the minute that we go into this system, the costs, if we decide to transition from it later, are going to be pretty high, right? If it can create a better foundation for growth and profitability, amazing. But if we're just doing it because it seems like what everybody else is doing and it's the new hot piece of software, let's make sure we really understand why we're thinking we ought to use it, right? And to your point, what are the outcomes that we can both monitor and also that we can create?
And that's important. And that goes back to even the beginning. So I'll be honest, in our world, e-commerce drives me crazy because all the e-commerce platforms charge massive fees. And if you build yourself on an e-commerce platform with social media and they all change their rules, you are no longer in business. So you got to make sure you own your infrastructure, your place of doing business and everything else, that you plan for that. Because what we're seeing is if you're on somebody else's platform, they are squeezing. And you've got to be able to pivot through that.
Yep, exactly. That's exactly right. And certainly, as we've seen, right, the costs of everything are increasing. So it would be logical that our software system costs would increase as those companies have increases. And so to your point, when we're looking at laying in the infrastructure, I think there's a couple of things, especially when it comes to the systems piece, as cyber threats continue to grow as well. I think that there's this other element you need to look at beyond just, is it the right tool and will it help us with our math formula, right, of increasing, profitability? But the other piece is, what's the risk, right? And is that third party product something that we can afford to have the risk, no matter what the positive outcome is?
Sometimes you need to build your own systems. And that's not easy as a small business owner just getting started. But the funny thing is, the biggest businesses are the ones that built a system to solve their problem because nobody else had. And then they turn that into a business, and then they've got a whole new business structure. and that's cool too. There's nothing wrong with that, Are there other types of infrastructure that we should also be considering?
I think obviously there are, right? I mean, I tend to think of things mostly these days in the era of remote and hybrid work coming down to people and systems. But, to your point, there have been a tremendous amount of investments made in physical infrastructure, right? And in whether it's equipment, whether it's beyond software systems, whether it's equipment or physical infrastructure, offices, et cetera, or even just the cadence and the way that we look at doing travel, right? There's travel that we do to clients, but sometimes, there's travel that's almost essential from a human relationship standpoint, right? Beyond with your clients, but with your own team, and if you kind of are either small and fairly spread out, or if you're medium-sized and growth-oriented, there are costs of a lack of real human contact. Even though, what we do with remote work is great, occasionally you do need to have folks, even in small groups, right, be able to come together and really understand who they are as humans to an extent outside of work, perhaps, to make sure that we work better together.
People structure.
Exactly.
and doing it. One of the areas I wanted to talk about was business disputes and breakups. People go into these partnerships, more often than not, they don't realize that there is a good chance it's going to come to an end, right? And it could be a variety of reasons, right? You disagree.
Yep.
It could be, somebody gets sick or dies or gets tired, no longer wants to do it. All of these things. And one of the things I have found, and one of the things every time someone comes to me and says, I want to start a partnership, I'm like, what's your dissolution plan? How are you going to break up? Or even if, let's just say one of you wants to sell out and one of you doesn't, how do we handle that? The more you can decide everything up front, have it clearly written down, the easier it is when that time comes to say, this is the plan that we agreed upon. This is what we're going to do.
That's right. And I mean, you hit the nail on the head, right? And, as somebody who was trained as a lawyer and practices as a lawyer with a portion of my time, right? Those foundational documents, right? If it's a corporation, it's the bylaws and the shareholder agreement. If it's a limited liability company, it's the operating agreement. If it's partnership, it's your partnership agreement. Far too often, we will see very light touch organizational documents, right? That are pulled off a website or downloaded from somewhere with your initial organization or incorporation package. And they don't, to your point, set models in place to effectively allow for management of, let's say, not emotionally charged, but just disagreements, right, over the direction of the business, right? And that's, goes back to one of those things where bringing someone in if you're two people, right, and whether your partnership is a partnership or a corporation or an LLC, if you're just two people trying to make decisions, there's going to be times where you don't agree, right? And having someone else there, whether they have an actual right to vote or they're just there to help arbitrate and allow folks to kind of see each other's points, or even just say, hey, look, everybody, you all ultimately have to make this decision. But listening to the two sides of this, here's an unbiased opinion that doesn't have any economic interest, but wants to see you all continue. Those are the types of things from a human perspective that are important. And you can engineer those obviously into the legal agreements. But the other thing that, as you pointed out, is important is to have that whole flow of how, if the folks who start a business are no longer there, right, and it's they've met an untimely demise or something else, how you navigate out of those, right? And then are there other documents or arrangements that are required to support that, right? Are there funded buy sell agreements, as you continue to grow? Those types of documented frameworks are incredibly important. Frankly, I would say not just for the folks who are driving the business, but for their families, and just as importantly, for the entire team that works with them. Because we can see businesses, really destroy themselves from the inside when you have these disputes among founders or co-owners.
It does. It sucks all your energy away, and you're busy fighting and not growing the business, and the business suffers through that, and it takes a major hit. And the opposite side of just even expectations. What are your roles? What are the expectations? Who's in charge of what? Who's going to handle X, Y, Z? And making sure that as business owners, you have the right people in the right seats. I can't tell you how many times I see this go not so well. And a lot of times business owners are too eager to give away ownership because they think that's the only way they can get great people. And I don't like business owners giving away their ownership. I think you took the risk and put the effort in. You ought to own it all, and you ought to be able to stay in control. There's nothing like getting kicked out of your own company.
Well, right. That's exactly right. And to your point, there may be mechanisms where you do get kicked out of your own company, but you ought to make sure that you and everybody else who's an owner or a partner in this understand those are the rules. They may be the rules, right? But let's make sure we're all clearly defining what they are, or that type of opportunity doesn't exist.
Very, very true. So let's touch on disaster preparedness and management. Because like I said, if you're drowning, you can't think, right? You really don't know how to deal with it. And to me, disaster preparedness, it could be weather, it could be death, right? One of the owners or somebody, or key man, or key people leave. It could be COVID. It could be economic changes. There's a whole bunch of this, I think, beyond just the standards. And if you are heavily based on software, what do you do? Because I heard just the other day, Square went down. So I think for 48 hours, nobody could collect money. Like, what are you going to do? How are you going to get through 48 hours and not lose all that business? Because I doubt they're giving them their money back. It's all that basic stuff. And how do you deal with it? Because you mentioned trying to figure out the world of remote. I built this business remote. And so when COVID hit, I was like, oh, look, the universe came my way. We were set up. We had cameras, microphones. Everything was ready. That's just how we did business. So it was easy to pivot. Whereas a lot of people early on struggled with Zoom.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And to your point, I like to say that my late Italian grandmother was sort of ahead of her time. She worried about everything. Right. And to your point, some of that genetic code passed on to me. So, when I first started businesses, I would be very worried about everything. And it took me a long time to try to figure out how to worry productively. Right. And that's sort of part of this whole theme, right? Is thinking about where does an emerging risk or threat come from? And how do we come up with a plan where when that does occur, that we can keep our business operating, even if it means we're changing a little bit. And a really foundational part of my business development as a business leader came from working at MVB Financial Corp. And obviously, banks and financial institutions have some pretty significant regulations when it comes to what happens when disaster strikes, right? There's this whole element of the way that the U.S. federal government regulates banks, other financial institutions related to business continuity management. And there's a desire, as we all want, right, for our financial institutions in the event of a cyber attack or in the event of some naturally occurring disaster, for us to be able to still get cash, do financial transactions. So they have to have a very regularized, regimented model for how they look at disasters that could occur, take a look at what they think the likelihood of probability is, and for the ones that are highly probable, and even for ones that have great risk but may not be as high in probability, come up with these plans of how you're going to continue to operate the business, serve the clients, and in this case, meet the requirements that our nation has, right, for a financial system. In reality, as you pointed out, we should all be doing that, right? And to me, that's a great way. We maybe don't need to do it with monthly or quarterly exercises as financial institutions are required, but we certainly should, on some cadence, look at the risks that exist that could strike us and figure out how to navigate, manage, and ideally respond to those in a way that our business emerges from them at least as strong as it was, and perhaps is ready to seize new opportunities as they present themselves.
And I'm very much like you. I like to look at all the risks that are out there and at least have a plan in place or a backup system in place so that if something goes wrong, we have an alternative to get back up and running and moving forward quickly. And to me, that is always, always important, having those systems so that things are just going to happen. That's life, right? You're ready to just move through it and be prepared and take that next step. It's much, much easier. And for our clients, we try and come up with recession plans to say, hey, how are we going to pivot ahead of, let's put plans in place for how we're going to change when XYZ occurs so that when XYZ occurs, we're not freaking out. We just take a step. And one of those, thinking about it is even just looking at all your employees and saying, well, if I have to make a cut, where do I begin? Because that way you don't have to get into the emotion of the minute. Again, it's a lot easier to think these things through over a glass of wine when there's nothing freaking out.
Well, right. And to your point around Square, one of the things that I've certainly advised clients who are in the business of relying on Square is, look, redundancy rules, right? And if you can make a little bit of an investment to have a secondary payment processor, that's probably highly valuable, right? Do you carry 2 credit cards in your wallet? Same concept, right? To your point, redundancy often rules.
In the same thing, secondary bank, so that if one bank goes down or something happens, I had a client where their bank cut them off because of something that wasn't their fault. And having the secondary bank, and then more importantly, if you've got a good reserve built up, keeping that in a separate bank so that if your main bank goes down, your reserve cash is somewhere else, untouchable, and nobody can accidentally swipe it out of your account.
Well, to your point, right on that, I do a little bit of investment in some of the companies that we advise. And, when Silicon Valley Bank had their most recent crisis, right, I was floored by the number of businesses that did not have multiple banking relationships and had literally all of their risk concentrated at SVB. It's amazing when you look at SVB, it's amazing to really consider the amount of aggregation of risk that happened with top venture firms, leading tech high flyer companies. And it's something that there's a valuable lesson there, right? Now, how long it will take folks to forget that occurred, right? It will be interesting, but my hope is that by watching that happen for at least 5 to 10 years, maybe we'll be good with folks diversifying their holdings.
And it might just be as simple as a backup internet provider, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
Because that is something that goes out. Like, what are you going to do if that happens, and how do you deal with it? So,
well, and to your point, what I tell folks is, look, you sometimes probably need a hotspot anyway, right? Whether it's just your phone or whether it's a separate hotspot. But you certainly, when your internet goes down, because it's going to happen multiple times during a year, you need to have a plan B that at least you and some members of your team who need critical access can get there, right?
And that's what it's all about. Just thinking through all this stuff and building a good, solid foundation. If people would like to learn more about you, learn about the book, what's the best way for them to do that?
So a great way would be to check out patrickesposito.com, where the book and a little bit about me exists, as well as initiativelabs.com and acmegeneral.com.
And we'll put that in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Rocky, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
If you own a business, check out Patrick's book, The Structure of Success, to learn about his strategic framework. All right, you've got to constantly look at your business across these 8 critical areas: your team, your strategy, your infrastructure, ownership, transactions, disputes, disaster planning, and succession planning. This is all the foundational stuff that most of us ignore. And the reality is, when you build on a strong system and a strong foundation, then everything happens well. And we don't have the messy conflicts with business partners we don't like, or when we try and go raise money, we don't have to deal with the bad decisions we made in ownership up front, or more taxes because we didn't think about it appropriately. Or if we get hit with life, disasters, cyber threats, COVIDs, economic shifts, we're ready to deal with them up front. Lets you sleep at night so much nicer. And remember, you don't need more resources. You need to be more resourceful. This is what we're talking about today, being more resourceful in creating the right foundations and focusing on the bottom line, profit in your pocket.
If you'd like for us to be a part of your profitability journey, we have different programs available ranging from do-it-yourself to one-on-one coaching. Our course, The Profit Blueprint, teaches you everything you need to know to transform your profitability. There are 3 different tiers ranging from DIY to done with you, so that businesses of all sizes can get the support that's best. Join the waitlist in the show notes to get more information and be a part of the next cohort. If you want a done for you service, you can hire us as your chief profitability officers. We only work with a handful of clients, so they all get our full attention. We work with business owners who have or are growing to $500,000 to $10 million in revenue. You can use the scheduling link in the show notes to get on our calendar for a good fit conversation to see if we're the right people to support you and how we can help you.
This episode of the Profit Answer Man podcast is brought to you by SMBpodcastnetwork.com. The network is a collection of podcasts and shows from around the internet which focus on bringing you interviews with amazing guests who share actionable advice, ideas, and information for small and medium-sized business owners and entrepreneurs. Visit www.smbpodcastnetwork.com to find more great shows and easily subscribe to be notified of new episodes. It's a great way to discover quality content. If you've discovered us via the network, then I hope you enjoy today's show and will consider subscribing directly so you never miss our episodes. Remember to check out my other podcast, Richer Soul, where we talk about how to live the ultimate life and be the best business owner you can be. As we close out, let's repeat the mantra. Revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, and cash is king. Have an abundant and profitable week.